Let's go to this now. As we mark Human Rights Day, the Constitution is also going to come under sharp focus this week. The Department of Justice and Constitutional Development will hold the National Conference on the Constitution, and the conference will also reflect on the road ahead. Let's look at this in context now with Human Rights Day as we speak to Advocate Dr. Mashabane, Department of Justice and Correctional Services Director General. Thank you so much for your time. I suppose there is no marking of a day like today, Human Rights Day, without also looking at the Constitution. Briefly share your reflections with us on a day like today.
Thank you very much, Bongiwe, and thanks to your viewers as well. Indeed, as you will know, Chapter 2 of our Constitution contains a Bill of Rights, which is mainly, a summation of what has been the struggle of centuries and decades, what South Africans aspired to until when the final Constitution was adopted with that Bill of Rights. So, in fact, today, the 21st of March, a celebration or an observation of Human Rights Day in a Human Rights Month, that part becomes important, that it is within the context of this Constitution.
And one of the things that, of course, one looks at when it comes to the Constitution are the different conversations that are being had by different parties as they reflect on this particular conversation. Let's look at the transformation of and building an independent judiciary, which is something that, of course, will be looked into tomorrow, from tomorrow onwards. But there are now also conversations that are renewed to say that if you're looking at the rights of people have a right to feel safe, but when it comes to some of what they see with the justice system is that they're being failed by some of the perpetrators that are not being put behind bars. Is this something that you'll also be reflecting on?
There will be a reflection on the state of national security in advancing constitutional democracy. But generally, the problem is not the Constitution, the problem is not the judiciary. The Constitution is a broad framework that permits for a number of things to be done. So you can still fight against crime within the confines of the Constitution. The Constitution cannot be the problem. It doesn't provide for everything, but it provides for a broad framework which then any government can develop programs to fight against crime. And then over the past 25 years, government has fought against crime, whether we're succeeding or not is something else, and it cannot be blamed on the Constitution.
And of course, when we talk about the Constitution, one thinks about, some of the conversations that you will then have when it comes to the role that traditional leadership will then play with the Constitution as well. And I suppose, how does that look like in 2023?
Look, so part of the conference in the program, as you see at the program, there will be a discussion in one of the breakaway, in one of the days that will look at the state of, traditional leadership in the country and the role of traditional leadership within a system of constitutional democracy that is undergirded by a constitution like ours. So I think we all know for post-1994 that in terms of the constitution, the system of traditional leadership is recognized as opposed to the situation before 1994. And indeed, traditional leaders and the traditional leadership system has been playing a significant role in contributing in the building and the transformation of the country in general. And I think there is generally an appreciation that the Constitution is supreme. So whatever the system of traditional leadership has to be aligned with the provisions of the Constitution and just to operate within that broad constitutional framework.
And let's talk about that, because also there is, you think about some of the things that are being put in place. Of course, we do have the Constitution. Of course, we do see, other legislative measures also being put in place in order to try and deal with different issues, that South Africa would face. Let's talk about, someone who's wondering tonight that I'm looking at the Constitution, it's giving me, talks about the Bill of Rights and the rights that are enshrined in there that must protect me. Of course, not all my rights are absolute. And then they juxtapose that with the ideals that are set up in the National Development Plan, which, for example, I'm going to pick one, which says that by 2020, people living in South Africa will feel safe and have no fear of crime. Women can walk freely in the streets and children can also be safe. And someone says, how do I reconcile the two? How do I treat one and look at the other? How do they balance one another out?
what South Africans have to understand in the main is that the drafters of our constitution were very bold and they were very futuristic. So the constitution provides your framework. It will not give you the details of how you're going to deal with specific challenges. And correctly, you mentioned the National Development Plan, which then is a program of action that government has to implement to address the challenges of the country. Now, the Constitution is that framework that empowers the citizens to say, in terms of the Constitution, those of you who are entrusted with the responsibility to govern, with responsibility to implement developmental programs, this is how we're going to hold you accountable. So that's what the Constitution does, if anything else. And it is very important that South Africans, ordinary South Africans, have an appreciation of what the Constitution is, so that they can hold their public representatives from a local government level, provincial government, even at a national level. They can hold their representative responsible and say, look, you have been given the resources, you have the budget, and you're supposed to implement this program. And in terms of the Constitution, if you don't, then we'll have to hold you accountable.
And very briefly, will ordinary members of society be allowed to be involved in a program like tomorrow, especially at the back of what you've just said?
So indeed, the conference that starts tomorrow is mainly inspired by the 25 years anniversary of the Constitution, which was last year on the 4th of February. And the idea is to have South Africans to reflect on the Constitution and say, yes, the lived experience of the past 25 years. Has the Constitution served what we thought it would serve? Has it allowed government to implement programs to achieve that vision of a non-racial, non-sexist, a united and prosperous democracy? So people who will be participating in the program will be from all walks of life in the country, from traditional leadership, from religious communities, from NGOs, academia, lawyers, judges and magistrates and politicians. So it is a conference. It's made up of not more than 600 participants, but everyone at least in the country. But also there will be other platforms in social media, YouTube and Facebook, that South Africans can participate in. And there will even be an allowance for them to raise their hands, even if they are not here in Kalaga Estate in person. But they can raise their hands and make a contribution, ask a question to the people who will be in the conference speaking and participating. So indeed, the whole idea in the next 3 days is to give South Africans an opportunity to dialogue, to make a reflection and say 25 years ago, when this Constitution came into operation, it was an aspirational and inspirational document. But now we have experience, a lived experience and a lived realities. And how do we reconcile that experience with what the Constitution stands for?
Yeah, and it's going to be an interesting one. So hopefully, of course, people do take the opportunity to reflect and, to have an honest conversation about where things stand and some of the reflections and what they look like. DG, thank you so much. A very important conversation we just had. That's Advocate Dr. Mashabane, Department of Justice and Correctional Services Director General. This is ahead, of course, of the Conference on the Constitution that looks at the road that has been traveled so far